You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Esther Awoni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss the build-up to Nigeria's 2019 elections, the economy and the banking industry. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awoni. Now, as events shape up ahead of Nigeria's 2019 elections, we'll delve into some topical issues that may impact Nigeria's economy and the banking sector. Mustapha Chike-Obi, the Executive Vice Chairman of Alpha African Advisory, is our guest today. Mustapha, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you. So we're going to talk elections and the banking sector and, of course, economy. But I'd like us to start with the Nigeria's banking sector, especially with what's been happening lately. Skybank, to be specific, the license was revoked, and the central bank says, you know what, the bank was not, or the board of the bank was unable to recapitalize the bank 2 years after the new board of management were put in. In your thoughts, talk to us about how your interpretation of how things panned out and the decision that was taken to revoke the license.
I think it was a very good decision. I think it was a timely and appropriate regulatory response to a problem. And I think that the problem has been, in my opinion, taken care of mostly. The next stage is to return the bank to private investors, with a process that I believe AMCON will initiate immediately.
Now, we've spoken to a number of analysts, economists, and their views have been mixed or are mixed. Some say, look, this problem started in 2014 when Skybank decided to buy the then nationalized bank, Main Street Bank, for an amount that they felt Skybank really couldn't afford. And then when things went south, that's one of the reasons why things went south in terms of their earnings. Their profit after tax went south, downhill, and the fortunes of the bank generally went south from then. And then two years later, when the management was sacked by the CBN and new management came in, they said that there was no chance of Skybank actually recovering, and the CBN should have seen it then that there would be problems down the line. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me just correct the impression that no bank was nationalized by AMCON. Nationalization
we're coming back to that conversation again.
Unconstitutional.
Okay.
It was bridged.
Bridged.
And this was also bridged and not nationalized. I think it's important. But there's a lot of misconceptions about Main Street Bank, Sky Bank, Sky Plus Main Street, and now Polaris Bank. The truth of the matter is that when Sky Bank purchased Main Street Bank, it was through a very rigorous process, and they had the highest bid. From the point of view of AMCON, it was who was the best bidder. That was our mandate. So they were the best bidder, and we were happy to sell it to them. The issue of whether or not they were able to buy the bank in terms of their finances was something CBN looked into. And CBN also concluded that they were able to pay for the bank.
But for 126 billion, that's what I mean. I remember there were a lot of arguments then that 126 billion. How much was the market capitalization of Skybank at that point, and why would they go and buy a bank that many people thought the amount was overpriced?
Well, yes, buying an asset that's overpriced would be a problem for anybody, no matter what your market cap is. But the argument is, was it really overpriced? And they had their calculations that made them think it was worth 126 billion. You have to understand that there were 4 other bids in the range of 100 billion for the same bank. They just happened to be the highest bidder. There was 4 other bids that were in that range of 100, 99, 98. I don't recall the exact numbers. So, but even if you take the purchase of Main Street Bank, it was 126 billion. The negative equity that's being filled today is 800 billion. That's only roughly 10, 15% of the problem. And so it's not fair to lay all the blame for the problems of Skybank on the purchase of Main Street Bank. I think the bigger problem, and it's a more systemic problem than that, is that we have a central bank that has maintained a very, very tight monetary stance in defense of the Naira and in defense of inflation. The average lending rate is about 30%. And so that leads to a lot of otherwise good businesses failing. Very few businesses can sustain a 30% borrowing rate, interest rate. So what has happened is that the banks that were actually doing banking, that were actually lending to businesses and to retail consumers, are the ones that are running into problems. The banks that were just taking deposits and buying treasury bills and not lending are the ones that have survived, because the problem is coming from the side of loans going bad. And the reason why loans are going back mostly A, the tough economic conditions, and B, the very, very tight monetary policy. If we want to reduce bad loans in the banking system and want to reduce this occasional or this regular failure of banks, the CBN has to take a very, very good look at easing its monetary stance. But that's something that at this time in the political calendar, it's probably not going to happen.
It's interesting you mentioned the non-performing loans, because at this week's MPC meeting, the central bank governor did mention that he's quite concerned about the rising levels of non-performing loans in the financial sector. He did say that, it's still strong and resilient, but obviously it's still a present problem. But what are your thoughts in terms, you just prefer the solution, but I'm not sure that that's something that the CBN is ready to take at this time, easing and bringing down the headline interest rate and just not focusing so much on inflation and just focusing more on boosting growth. But we know that has growth, as it were, has been sort of sacrificed for inflation, and that is a path that the CBN is on and will continue to be, at least as a signal. Those are the signals that we're getting from the MPC.
If the Nigerian authorities, economic authorities, fiscal and monetary, continue to prioritize naira stability or naira strength and inflation, as opposed to economic growth, we will eventually fall off a cliff. We cannot have so many young people out of work. There's already a concern in the Western world that many people are now emigrating to those worlds. Canada is receiving us now, but Canada is becoming a little bit worried about the rate of immigration. We have to deal with the fact that only economic growth in Nigeria can solve the problem long term. And whatever we need to sacrifice on the altar of double-digit economic growth, we must do that. And yes, let the politics go, let the elections go. But the policy must be growth, growth, growth. Anything else must be secondary to growth. Okay,
let's talk about Polaris Bank now, the bank that has, the bridge bank that has emerged from the defunct Sky Bank. What we know is that AMCON has three responsibilities now: recapitalize, inject some capital into the bank, which it has done, 786 billion term loan, stabilize the bank, and of course, look for interested investors or buyers to buy the bank. And we understand there's a 5-year window for that to happen. And I know that this probably brings back memories for you too, back then when we had some banks that were, like you said, bridged, not nationalized, right? I don't want to get that wrong again. So, but what memories does this bring back for you in terms of could become of Polaris Bank going forward, and what your expectations are in terms of how AMCON or NDIC, the CBN, can help guide this bank to a place of strength and stronger and viable enough for interested buyers?
Well, first of all, AMCON, like you said, have three things to do. Recapitalize the bank to zero, Polaris Bank, to get to zero, so remove the negative equity, which they have done. Capitalize it, add enough capital to make it capital adequate according to CBN ratios. That's step 2. And then step 3 is to find a buyer who now takes what we now consider to be a very strong and profitable institution, which is step 3. That's step 3. I don't think it will take 5 years. I think it will take 1 or 2 years. And once it is sold, the new buyer will now have the responsibility for servicing this loan or this quasi-equity that has been put into Polaris Bank. I think they have improved on what we did before. I think that having the Polaris Bank being responsible for paying back this capital, it's important.
But is it still basically the same model that AMCON is following?
It's just, I think it's the same model, but it has been improved.
Improved, okay.
So instead of having the industry as a whole pay off over time, you have Polaris Bank paying off its own intervention independently of the AMCON sinking fund. So I think that's an improvement, and I think that that's a model that will work for any time in the future, and that's a model I think the world will copy. So I think it's a very well-contained solution to what could have been a difficult problem.
Now, to go back to the banks in general and the business of banking, you mentioned earlier that, talking about lending, how the environment is difficult. I'm just wondering, it would appear that the banks have been able to get by, as it were, especially the tier ones. Most of what they do is bonds and treasury bills, lending to the government, and they get, very juicy returns, 15, well, down to around 12, 13% right now, but still good, compared to other emerging market peers. But the model of lending and the bank's role, intermediation role in the economy, that hasn't been too strong. What do you foresee down the line for Nigeria's banking industry? When you look down 10 years down the line, do you think that this model is sustainable? It looks like we've done it for several years, and it looks like it's they've been able to get by, basically? Do you think that they will continue to get by just coasting along, not really lending to the economy as it were, just being very careful not to, of course, raise NPLs in the system, just coasting along, basically?
Yes, it's not sustainable. What the banks are doing now, they're taking deposits from people and lending it to the government. And it looks like a riskless business, and they're making 10% net interest margins. You don't have to have a lot of loan officers. You don't have to have a lot of... It's an easy business. But it's been condoned by the central bank. There are a number of things central bank can do. Central bank can have sectoral allocations. If you don't lend X amount to certain sectors, then we will fine you in some way. We will charge you in some way for lending to government. We will tax your revenues from lending to treasury bills at a different rate. We will tax your revenues when you lend to businesses. There are ways you can administratively encourage banks to do the right thing. And keep in mind, banking is a licensed business. It's a privilege, not a right. So if you're going to get a license, then you must live with the rules under which you get that license. So I think that banks can be compelled to do the right thing.
I think because I just remembered now, the previous MPC meeting where the CBN talked about allowing banks to have access to part of their cash reserve ratio, to lend to specific sectors that labor intensive, and I think giving out loans for a period of up to 7 years at 9%. I mean, some said that, okay, this could be a way to get banks to actually lend at single digits, to vulnerable sectors that are labor intensive and could actually boost the economy. We're not sure if we're feeling the impact yet, but I mean, that was one policy that was completely different.
I can tell you that that policy wasn't well thought out. I can tell you that no bank will do it. No bank is going to take the additional risk of lending for 7 years to a non-productive sector because they might as well just leave the money is safe where it is. So I don't think that it was well thought out. I think it should come from the side of penalty. If your income is coming from treasury bills, then we'll tax that income at a higher rate than if your income is coming from something else. I think that way you have a better result than asking somebody to take risk that they don't want to take. It's the same thing with the mortgage lending. I predicted that the NMRC, the way it was structured, would make no impact on the mortgage market because they were addressing the wrong problem, which is to insure the homeowner versus insuring the lender. The lender is not going to take the risk. So it sounds good. It's a nice sound bite. It's a nice sound bite in the political ear, but it's not going to have any impact.
Okay, Mustapha, hold that thought for us. We'll take a quick break, and I'll come back and pick up from where we left off. Thank you so much for your time. So far, I've been speaking to Mustapha Chike-Obi, Executive Vice Chairman of Alpha African Advice. We're continuing our focus on developments in Nigeria. Still with me is Mustapha Chike-Obi. He's the Executive Vice Chairman of Alpha African Advisory. Mustapha, thank you for your time so far. Let's talk about the Nigerian economy. We have the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, the blueprint, the anchor on which that the economy is anchored. But we've seen a slowdown in momentum. First quarter, we're at 1.9% GDP. Now, following quarter, we're at 1.5%. And economies that I've spoken to have told me that they're expecting the next GDP number to come in lower than 1.5%. So what is your assessment? From the last time we spoke, you weren't too optimistic. And now it would appear that part of that has been proven. But what would you say we can do now? I don't want us to focus on what is wrong. What is it that we can do to make things better?
Well, how can you make things better if you don't focus on what's wrong? But I think we're in serious trouble. This slowdown is coming in an election year where money is generally spent, a lot of money is spent, and it adds a boost to the economy. It's coming when oil is close to, it's now at $82 a barrel. We should have grown our economy. And it's coming at a time when things should be much better. And so it's actually much worse than we think. The real problem, the real elephant in the house is the fact that we have an unsustainable debt service to revenue ratio. Our revenues are not as high as we want it to be. Federal government revenues last year, 2017, I believe was about 3.5 trillion naira. Debt service was close to 60% of that. That having debt service so much a big part of your revenues is unsustainable. So yes, what we have to do, first and foremost, is raise revenues. And that's the most important thing. How do we raise revenues so that our fiscal situation can look better? That's the first thing. A lot of the tax policies that we're creating are not going to be huge revenue raisers.
What we hear is that it would take time. I mean, we had the VADs.
And they didn't
What we hear is that it would take time. I mean,
but VADs didn't even hit up to 10% of its target. And again, we need to be realistic about the revenues. This NLC asking for increased salaries is an issue. So I think that we must pursue a path of growth. So when you ask me all this, I always go back to growth. If we want to grow the economy, we have to have much lower interest rates. We have to spend less money on governance, and we have to look at our debts and see what we can do about reining in our debt service. Those are the three things we must do. But right now, our fiscal situation is unsustainable. I think GDP in the next GDP will be under 1%, and I think that in 2019, I think things will be very, very bleak.
Now, the economy is going to be a hot topic, especially now that we're going into the election cycle. People are going to, I mean, candidates, presidential, governorship, at whatever level, are going to be talking about how they can make the economy better or the state of the economy. And of course, people are going to be assessing the state of the economy looking at the scorecard, as it were, of the this present administration. Do you think, to what extent do you think this could impact on how electorates, how voters want to go out and vote based on the economic conditions?
Well, let's assume we're talking about a free and fair election. If it's a free and fair election, I think that the current government will be marked very strongly. They'll be very strongly against the current government if it's free and fair. And we have to assume that it's going to be free and fair. But there's something I failed to mention, which is very important to me, which is that we're running three huge subsidies in Nigeria today that amount to about 4 trillion naira a year. Those subsidies have to be looked at. The biggest of the subsidies is the foreign exchange subsidy. The Central Bank of Nigeria purchases all the dollars that Nigeria generates as a government at 305. And they sell it anywhere from 305 to 360. I think the 305 to 360 is a subsidy. It's a hidden subsidy. If they give it to people at 305, those people are being subsidized to 55. If they sell it at 360 to some people, then they're making 55 naira per dollar. That amounts to somewhere like 1.5 to 2 trillion naira a year if you calculate how much dollars we generate in any given year. That subsidy should be removed. It should be removed very simply by selling CBN. If you buy naira at a certain rate, you must sell it no more than 2% higher than that rate. So if the number is 305, then you can't sell it at more than 315. If you sell it at 360, you have to buy it at 350. What about the 2% ranges? Because that subsidy is being taken from the federal government and is being taken from the states. If we remove that, there'd be 2 extra trillion in revenues to the federal government if they were actually paying 360 for the foreign exchange as opposed to 305. That's one subsidy, and that's the biggest one. The second subsidy is the fuel subsidy. It's now at 1.2, 1.3 trillion going to be in this year. That can't be sustained. And the final subsidy is the electricity subsidy. We are asking people to sell electricity at an economic rate. That's why you're not getting more power.
So you're saying we do not have cost-reflective tariffs?
Yes, we don't. It's not even close. So that's why you don't have any more. People are not generating more power. People are not distributing more power. And the people that are doing it are losing money, and the government is owing them. So we must deal with these subsidies. Those 3 subsidies I've mentioned add up to about 4 trillion naira a year. Okay,
let's get back to the elections. We're having primaries, at least for Lagos State, this weekend.
Yes.
I mean, there's been a lot of drama and intrigue, as it were, and it's always interesting when you see how candidates are jostling for, at least at the primary level, for the primary ticket. What are your thoughts in terms of how, for a Lagos State, the revenue that's generated and how the politics are playing out?
Well, there's no drama in Lagos State as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
No governor has a automatic right to come back. So the only reason why a governor comes back is because people think he has done a good job. So if Ambode thinks he's done a good job, he should go and fight for the ticket and people will vote him in. The fact that people think that there's an automatic right to be come back as a governor is annoying to me.
But it would appear that that's been the practice, where someone is, in quote, anointed, and there's a special group of people who present the person on a certain platform.
Well, then it's a good thing.
And it would appear that he automatically gets the votes of the people in the state because he's come from, a certain.
Well, then it's a good thing that this is happening. And it's a good thing that people are being told, you don't have a God-given right to come back. You have to perform. Fashola apparently performed, that's why he came back. Before him it was Tinubu. Tinubu performed as a governor, and he came back. So if Ambode or anybody else, there's a question about his performance, then it's a good thing that the people know that performance is the only basis for coming back. So I don't think it's drama. I think it is very healthy. I think that everybody is abusing APC for putting Ambode's feet to the fire is wrong. I think politicians are realizing now that votes do count. I think if you look at the massive effort that the ruling party employed in Ekiti, and they barely won, and the massive effort that they're doing in Osun, who knows what the result will end up being, but it was closer than it has ever been in Osun between the two parties. I think that they're realizing now that people matter, and you have to go and try and get people's votes. And the best way to get people's votes is by performing. I think it is clear. I think it is clear even to the presidential level that they're going to have a fight on their hands. So I think that the welfare of the people still matter. I think that the resources of the government, the ability of the government to support the welfare of the people is limited.
But what would you say will be the most important issues for people that they want in terms of who's going to come and who's going to be their elected representative, either the federal as president or governor? What would one or two issues that you think are the most important to voters right now?
I think performance is the most important thing to voters right now. And I think that we are maturing as a democracy. You forget that in the US, when they started the democracy, they used to have duels and shoot each other. And so we are getting there. And I'm actually quite encouraged by Osun. I think that if there were going to be shenanigans from the ruling party, they could have done it. They could have done it much easier. So I think that we're growing. I think social media is extremely important. I think people are now able to express their views about many things, and I think it's extremely, extremely important. And I think we'll get there. We'll get there. And one of the things I tell people is I want Buhari to get a fight in this election. I want him to have a serious fight. If he ends up winning...
having a strong opposition, someone to give him a good competition.
If he ends up winning again, he will be bound by one or two things he has said to win. Let us bring the best out in whoever wins. Let him say what he will do. Let us hold their feet to the fire. They can come and disappoint us. That's usual. Husbands disappoint wives, wives disappoint husbands. But that doesn't. But let's at least get the best people. Let them say what they're going to do. Buhari must debate whoever he's going to defeat. If I can tell, free advice to the APC, if he doesn't do a debate, he will lose the election. If he doesn't put himself up for debate.
Have debates been very key for us? I mean, I'm just trying to cast my mind back to the last, but we're not and the number of debates that we had and who even participated.
But we got away with it. But I say it's an evolving process. We're going to have debates this time. They're going to have to come and tell us what they're going to do to make the country better, to arrest all these terrible things happening in this country. Because there are a lot of things wrong. So without coming and telling us how you're going to fix them, you're not going to be able to win this election. And I think that performance, policy, and honest caring for the people will determine these elections. Okay, so from what I deduced, economy, the state of the economy, obviously, what will be important for people? Performance. So performance, yes. I'm thinking along the lines of the state of the economy. It's more than economy. We are very divided. So we have to find somebody who can unite the country. We are the economy is in bad shape. So you have to tell us the policies that you have that will fix it. And thirdly, you have to look to the future. Look, these are old men. And I'm an old man too. We have to start grooming the younger people who have a much bigger stake in what's happening than we do now to take over. So somebody who has an eye and programs, educational programs, social programs, that will bring up the youth and bring up the next generation will be very important. Okay, Mustapha, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Mustapha Chike-Obi, Executive Vice Chairman of Alpha African Advisory. That's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged
with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awoni. From myself and the rest of the team, do have a great day.